Hello and welcome to Commsverse. This session is called Designing Microsoft Teams Call Flows in a Complex Global Organization, and today will be presented to you by Josh Blaylock. So without any further ado, over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everybody to the session. Thank you for attending. The title of the session is going to be Designing Microsoft Teams Call Flows in a Complex Global Organization. I was really going for how lengthy of a title can I get, trying to see if I took the cake for that at the first ever Commsverse 2020. This is pretty awesome, and I want to give a big shout out to all the people that put tireless effort into making this happen. Mark Vale has led a fantastic team, and this is quite an amazing thing to see pulled off, and I'm really excited to be a part of it with this session today. Without any further ado there, let me go ahead and advance to the next slide here, and we'll start talking through this. Give you a bit about me to start. I'm a Microsoft MVP in the Office Servers and Services area, as most MVPs that are taking part in the conference probably are with the Teams background. My specialty comes from the Microsoft Link and Skype for Business background. I've been doing unified communications and voice for quite some time. I'm also a partner and principal cloud architect at Cloudway. You might have seen a couple of videos floating around if you've ever YouTubed anything in the Microsoft Teams world of a guy in a cowboy hat. That is yours truly. I'm from the Sunshine State here in the U.S., Florida. I put one of my favorite pictures of Florida there next to it because that is a pretty standard picture of Florida for much of the year. Big old giant hurricane off one of our coasts. Just pick one. Also love to do outdoors things like kayaking and hiking, doing that with the family, and kind of have a bad habit of adopting way too many animals. So that's a bit about me personally and my professional and community-facing self. And now I'd like to leave the personal stuff behind and actually get into what you're probably most here for, learning about global call flows in a complex organization. The agenda is going to be a few high-level points. And what I want to point out here is that in about 35 or 40 minutes, because I do want to leave some time for Q&A at the end and all that good stuff, it's very hard to cram complex call flows into that amount of time. There's a lot to go over and a lot of groundwork to lay. And so this is going to be somewhat high level. I would say it's still a level 300 session because you kind of really need to have a background in some of these concepts to understand where we're going with it. But I wouldn't describe it as some 400 or 500 level session because we're not really getting into the nuts and bolts of configuring many of these concepts. That's my little bit of a precursor for what the session's going to be like, just so you know. We're going to start out by identifying all the main components of a global telephony organization, talk about things that are both on-prem, in Microsoft Teams, other telephony things that we just need to make sure we understand all the bits and pieces before we talk into how they work together. We want to cover understanding what your call flows currently look like in an organization versus what you want them to look like. You know, there's going to be a lot of feature mapping or feature changes that take place as you map out how to design these complex call flows. And so getting a good understanding at the beginning of any type of project where you're doing this is, I can't stress the importance of that enough. Then we're going to go on to some of the native Microsoft 365 phone system capabilities. The phone system platform has greatly expanded over the last year or two. A lot of enterprise voice-like features have popped up in it, and it has become a real contender as far as phone systems go. Lots of people have flocked to it. And especially in the midst of all this COVID coronavirus craziness that the world is having to grapple with, and businesses are having to grapple with, the Microsoft 365 phone system has come even more into the limelight. Finally, we want to talk about gluing all these pieces together with direct routing. Direct routing is another beast of a topic that we could just go into for hours, but we don't have that. So we're going to stay fairly topical with it and talk about why it is the glue. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a little bit of Q and hopefully A. I do my best to provide answers. It might be a, we'll get back to you on that. Or it may be a, quite frankly, I have no idea. But whatever the case is, we'll definitely have the Q and we'll work on the A. All right? Let's jump on into this. The hardware and analog components. So there's several physical things in an environment that you need to consider. As you move to the cloud, that doesn't mean everything is going virtual and you don't have to worry about anything physical ever again when it comes to telephony. You still got a great number of things that tie into your telephony environment that you must consider. First, you've got your traditional PBXs and IP PBXs, okay? These are where all of your legacy phone systems and phones are tied into. Other analog devices are tied into your PBXs. You may even have your carrier connection coming into your PBX. And it is likely that at least for a period of coexistence with Teams and direct routing, you'll need to be connected into this physical PBX on site. And so that's definitely a consideration there. Related to that is your analog phones. So you might have phones that need to tie in via PBX. Maybe after the PBX is gone, you still need to maintain physical phones. You might have some analog devices that are phones or other types of analog devices that you can't virtualize or move to the cloud. And those will need to still connect to something on-prem, direct routing, SBCs, in order for you to continue to have these analog components communicate with your internal users as they move into Microsoft Teams. And then we've got fax. That kind of goes along with analog phones. Fax, believe it or not, many organizations, or many people, I should say, are quite surprised to learn that fax is still a thing. And lots of other organizations are very quick to say, oh, yeah, it is definitely very much a thing. That's silly of you to think that it's not. You know, you can think what you want about how old and antiquated it is, but it is still very much a part of many customer environments, I assure you. Meeting room systems. So there's native Microsoft Teams room systems, Skype room systems if you're in a Skype for Business environment. There are other types of room systems that may have to come into play that might work with Cisco equipment or other types of platforms, Zoom rooms, etc. You need to think about how they are going to fit into the picture. It doesn't necessarily mean they're a direct component of your telephony environment, but they need to be considered as to how the voice component is going to tie in. And finally, this kind of goes in line with the analog items up top, but elevators, overhead paging systems, your after-hours night bells. These are all things that might not be needed at certain types of businesses, but at other types of businesses or large shops, manufacturing plants, places where you have people working on these big, large production floors, they might not hear a phone ring at a desk off in some far corner. You need these overhead paging systems or night bells that will come through. These are typically analog setups. A lot of them are IP-based now, but they need to be considered as far as how they're going to integrate with Teams, and that's usually through direct routing and an SBC. These software components and add-ons. So we've talked about the hardware, physical side of it. There are many software components to consider, some of which may be working with Microsoft Teams. Others have worked with Skype for Business, but are not quite to Teams yet. There's a lot of different things to consider here. Some of them are roadmap items that are rolling out any day now. As you look down this list, I think you'll see some of those that you recognize as kind of being in that last bucket. They're almost here. We've seen the previews. There's actually a lot of cool previews and new announcements and things that are being showcased at Commsverse in these categories. There are call centers coming into Teams or that are already kind of there. Call and compliance recording has made its way onto the scene, and that was an announcement last year from Microsoft. Attendant console through various third-party vendors. And then you've got dial-in conferencing. This is a native Microsoft Teams capability, but there are different considerations that you need to take into an account here. Are you migrating dial-in conferencing from Skype for Business to Teams? If you are, do you need to keep the numbers that you're already using? Or the numbers not important? They probably were important if you had specific toll-free numbers that you were publishing in marketing materials. So there's many of these factors about the dial-in conferencing solution that have to be taken into consideration as a whole before you just kind of discount it as, oh yeah, we can just bolt on dial-in conferencing at the end. That doesn't quite compute in many situations. So definitely give thought to how that factors into the overall global approach. Now, one of the things that is asked about here is bringing dial-in conferencing capabilities through direct routing. That's kind of one of those asterisk caveat areas. You can't just do that for your regular tenants, but there are some capabilities for doing that at the governmental tenant levels. So I would advise you to look those up if you might fall into that last category there and you need something like that. But regular commercial tenants don't have direct routing capabilities for dial-in conferencing. So that is a native Teams component. And then lastly, hunt groups and auto attendance. These are capabilities that are usually present on your PBXs as they already exist. Maybe if you're in Skype for Business, you have response groups in there, and you've been using auto attendance with Exchange. There's a great number of ways that these two concepts are implemented and provided by different vendors. And so depending on what they need, it may be a pretty feature by feature comparison with what's available in Teams, or there may be some things or call flows within them that change. And you need to kind of take those into an account. Usually there's a good comparable solution if a one-to-one option is not there. But these are things that you must make sure you take into consideration as you start to plan this out. I mentioned above that dial-in conferencing is not capable for being serviced through direct routing in commercial tenants. However, your call queues, which is really what hunt groups are, and your auto attendants can be serviced through a direct routing connection. So you can use on-prem phone numbers to deliver connectivity, dial tone, phone numbers to your auto attendants or call queues or both, all depending on what you may or may not need there. Core telephony components. So stepping aside from the software side of it and the hardware side of it, what are some basic telephony things that you need to make sure that you're accounting for and baking into these plans and designing these call flows? One, how does voicemail fit into this? In the Microsoft world, that is now Azure Voicemail. There are many types of third-party voicemail systems. Sometimes that is a pain point for migrating, especially if users feel like they need to bring voicemail with them, not just the capability, but old voicemails. That's really not an option. So these are things you also need to talk about as you're looking at the transition and how calls are going to flow. Voicemail is one where you're kind of starting from scratch if you're not already using Azure Voicemail, but it is there, and there are a lot of voicemail management capabilities that you get with that. Custom dialing patterns. So a lot of organizations have had the age-old 4-digit, 5-digit, 3-digit dialing, or dial 1267 to reach the phone down the hall, or dial 3 digits and then jump up and down 7 times to reach the kitchen. All kinds of very interesting dialing patterns that you come across in different environments. Some of these, if you're lucky as a consultant, you're able to kind of help customers see the light of embracing Microsoft's modern way of doing this and doing dial by name where possible, looking up the endpoints you want to call. But there are many organizations that simply cannot get away from these dialing patterns for one reason or another. Again, it might be that these numbers are printed on materials and distributed throughout the environment, whatever the case may be. If you need to have custom dialing patterns, you can build custom dial plans within your tenant with a large number of normalization rules to accommodate various patterns. But you need to take a look at what those patterns are now in the environments that users are going to come from, and maybe even not just come from. Maybe you're going to continue to have people live in a legacy PBX environment while some are in Teams for an extended period of time. Maybe there are things that hold them back there. Maybe there are third-party software integrations that you cannot connect to Teams yet. So you have to have these on-prem legacy PBX approaches, and you need to maintain these custom dialing patterns between those environments. This helps you and allows you to do that. So take a good accounting of what those are. Emergency calling, there are all kinds of requirements, and they're by country, by region, by industry. There are dynamic capabilities now within Microsoft Teams. That was something that people were waiting for a long time, the ability to have dynamic emergency E911 calling. That is there. You can now upload subnet and building information and all that good stuff so that the location of a call is pinpointed for your PSAP. But that's another thing that you have to really think about as you're moving from one system into another. You don't want to interrupt emergency calling at any point. So make sure you consider that as part of this. Your call controls. Everybody knows that there are various things you can do with the phone when a call comes in. Put it on hold, transfer it, do a consult transfer to make sure it's a warm handoff. Then there's their dial tone. This last item. This is kind of the big piece, right? You've got your PBX and you've got the ability to have calls and all that, but you don't have a dial tone yet or a way to get calls in or out until you've got a carrier who is providing the services. So there becomes a big decision here. Where is your dial tone coming from? And not just where is it coming from, but where is it coming from for each region? We're talking about complex global environments. Microsoft as a carrier is not available in most countries. It's available in, about 9, I think right now, 9 to 10, maybe 11. My numbers could be slightly off, but it's somewhere in there. It's not a lot yet. So for those countries, great, Microsoft can be the carrier. For other countries, you're going to need to use direct routing and maintain your existing carrier on-prem for that dial tone. So that is kind of understanding the components. Now we need to understand what the call flows actually look and feel like in the current environment so that we can best decide and design the new environment. Or the future state, I really should say, because when it comes to saying new environment, you'll have components of it that are new, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of it's new, and it has to be able to work together. First, again, we just kind of talked about that dial tone. We need to understand, as we start to do this analysis of the overall picture, we need to go site by site, location by location, region by region, and assess which ones Microsoft can be the carrier for and which ones they can't. When Microsoft can be the carrier, it's called PSTN calling. It's a license that you have to purchase from Microsoft and assign to a user. And essentially, at that point, you're assigning a pool of minutes to that user, and they can place calls out to the PSTN through Microsoft. Since that's only available in some places, you can only do that in some places. And even then, even if you can do it in one country, maybe based on the contract that you've got with your existing carrier, maybe it doesn't make financial sense. And so you decide that you only want to roll it out in certain offices, but in some, even though you can, you've got to stick with the carriers in those offices. Weighing all these factors, understanding those existing contracts and the cost, understanding the volume of calls that are going to be placed and the number of minutes used every month, these are going to be hugely important in making this decision of how you PSTN ingress or egress for a given location. And the other part of that is, hey, are we going to have a period of coexistence? Are we going to do a clean cutover in this location? Or are we going to be between platforms for quite some time in this location? Do we have Skype for Business servicing the location? Do we have a third-party PBX? These will all help you decide whether or not you need to switch to Microsoft as your carrier or keep your existing one. The other big item that will help decide whether or not you can, use Microsoft as the carrier, or whether or not you really do need to keep all of your calls local where possible, is where government regulations come into play. So when you place a call that would otherwise go through the PSTN, but you go from a user in one country to a user in another country, and you avoid all those tolls by your local carriers for long distance because you're using your internal VoIP system, that's called toll bypass. And there are some places where local telephony carriers haven't appreciated that and have had good luck in convincing the local government there to make sure there are regulations in place that protect their businesses from losing those tolls. That's a rather, I hope, diplomatic way of putting that. We'll just leave it at that. But in other words, for people wanting to use a system like this, they can't just hop on a Teams client in one country where there are government regulations, call the Teams client in another country, and have that call go VoIP behind the scenes, accruing no tolls and bypassing the local carriers. That's just not allowed in some places. And so that is a very important one to make sure you understand, that you understand the ins and outs and what the specific regulations are, and that you are abiding by your local regulations before deciding to shift from a local carrier to Microsoft as a carrier. Chances are, it's probably almost guaranteed Microsoft's PSTN calling is not going to be available. in countries where that's a requirement. But you still could bypass those local tolls by calling users internally, and that is something where you have to keep that in mind. So there are settings within those within Microsoft Teams, within the Teams Admin Center, that prevent toll bypass from happening, and that's something you have to consider as you design how calls should flow from one region to the next. Once we kind of have an understanding there, we really want to evaluate at each location the types of calls that we expect to be made and what those personas look like. Are all users at a given site going to be governed by the same dialing patterns? Or do we have certain users who should have more privileged calling capabilities? For example, should certain users be able to dial domestic calls only, while others are allowed to dial international? Well, some are not allowed to do either. Their calls need to stay internal. There are various access levels that you may or may not have, and you might have access levels defined in one region, but not in another. And so as you go through and do these site analysis at each site, that you need to identify where is the PSTN ingress egress, and then you need to define what are our personas, what are the calling restrictions, and you're going to define different voice routing policies, PSTN usages, and call routes or voice routes based on these factors, and we'll get to what those look like in a minute. Again, is location-based routing required? Do we have to make sure we're abiding by those local laws? And then where does on-prem dialing integration exist? So if we're looking at a site that specifically we know has analog devices, well, very clearly that tells us, hey, direct routing is going to be a component for this site. We know that. We have elevators and analog phones, and we're not going to get around that. We have to connect them into the environment. So for this site, we need direct routing. For the next site 2 miles down the road, we actually don't. We can keep all those calls in Teams, and we're good. All of our boxes are checked, and we don't have to worry about putting direct routing there. That will still enable, depending on the types of calls we're allowing between sites and between groups of users, that'll still allow those analog devices to be reached from not just that local site, but any other site that they need to be able to be reached from. Finally, you're going to want to, well, not finally, the second to last point here, backup and failover routes. So you might have direct routing in SBC deployed at one location, and that might be fine for that location. But you might have another location that has serious high availability requirements, and therefore you need to plan in not just one route to an SBC from your Teams environment, but 2 routes to 2 SBCs for that one location. You'll mark one of them as primary and the second as secondary, and we'll go over in a minute kind of how you can order different elements to prioritize one gateway over the other. Finally, and I cannot hammer on this enough, especially in a global deployment with locations across various countries, understanding the network and bandwidth at each site is hugely important, because you might have a majority of locations that have awesome WAN setup and great bandwidth capabilities, and you're not worried at all about it. You know, sure, you're going to turn on QoS, but you'll probably never even scratch that, right? But then you might have a couple locations. Maybe you're a business that has oil rigs, and you need to have workers on those oil rigs be connected via satellite. Maybe there are locations that simply have really sketchy networks that are hugely unreliable, and you need to kind of understand what the parameters are of those networks, what your limitations are, and try to plan accordingly. You obviously can't plan for all types of failure, but it might be that you've got a location that experiences very frequent internet outages. Knowing that might guide you to say, okay, we're going to put an SBC physically in that location, and we're going to buy phones that can connect to that SBC so that we still have dial tone, survivability dial tone out of that location and out that local carrier, even if we lose our connection, our internet connection to Teams. So these are Teams phones, and they can't sign into Teams, but they still have survivability for that dial tone to go out that local SBC. that could be a really important design decision for you if you have locations with super poor network environments. Call flows design looking to the future. So we kind of have outlined some of the really key important things we want to consider and really soak in. That's great. Now, where possible, if simplicity of the deployment is important to us, we would like to have those call flows stay cloud only via the Microsoft 365 phone system. And in order to do that, we're going to need to port numbers to Microsoft. So we need to plan out the porting process. That is sometimes fairly quick and straightforward. Sometimes ports don't get approved and you have to go back and forth. It can be a lengthier process that you don't have 100% control over. So where porting numbers is involved, make sure you start to do that sooner rather than later. And if you are going to be able to have a location go pure cloud, Microsoft as the carrier, as mentioned, you need to purchase the calling plan licensing and assign it to the users in that location. Direct routing, you've got to implement this no matter what in a few scenarios here. So we've already determined, based on these factors, we can't go cloud only in this location. Direct routing is for sure going to be part of this specific location because of these reasons. One, carrier dial tone is maintained, or, and by maintained, I mean you're choosing to maintain it, or you require it. Maybe you've got a contract that's not going to be up for a while. Maybe there are other requirements that are forcing you to keep your current contract with your carrier in place. So you simply can't go cloud only and you need to have direct routing connecting you. Analog connectivity is required. If you have analog devices, again, you must connect to the cloud via Microsoft Teams direct routing. And then if you need to maintain a period of coexistence with those legacy environments we referenced earlier, that is again going to dictate that, yes, direct routing is a part of our global design for the site moving forward. Implementing the failover routing with direct routing here. So if we have decided that we need to have high availability of some sort, we cannot have a single point of failure with our SBC for any given site, or it could be spread across multiple sites. There's a couple different ways we can achieve that. One is the SBC level routing, and this is where you have two SBCs that are talking to each other. They have high availability licensing applied and capabilities have been assigned to them, and they can intuitively know when the other one is down and then take on the routing of all calls through the one. So that's one way that you can do your failover routing. The other way is to design alternate voice routes in Microsoft Teams. So this is kind of your outbound routing here, but you can say, look, we're going to try this gateway first. And if that gateway fails, great, we're going to go down the list via our PSTN usages to the next gateway and try to go out that one. And in which case, there are things that you have to iron out at the carrier level to make that all work and make sure that calls are allowed to egress out of both locations. But these are a couple different ways that you can implement a high resiliency or high availability in your environment. The call routing building blocks. Now, if you are familiar with Skype for Business and designing enterprise voice setups in Skype for Business, then this will be a fairly familiar slide to you, at least the concepts on it, not the slide itself, because this is just something I put together. But looking over this, you can kind of see, okay, dial plan. I know what a dial plan is. This is what defines the patterns that we're allowed to dial. This is where we say, okay, we're going to dial 4 digits, and it's going to get normalized to an E164 number. That's what a dial plan does for us. Now, a call might fall flat dead at the dial plan level. A user might have a dial plan assigned, and they might try to dial some pattern that isn't allowed, and the call goes nowhere. Assuming they dial something that fits within the dial plan, then they would go on to voice routing policies. Now, for reference on the subsequent slide, I've kind of included some example names of these dial plans and these building blocks. So let's say we've got a dial plan in the US and a dial plan in the EU, right? And that's probably a little too vague. You'd probably need multiple different types of dial plans for the different countries throughout the EMEA area. And even in the US, we may have to break that down by different types of dial plans for different locations. But these are just high-level examples. So you assign a dial plan to a user on the Teams level, and you also assign a voice routing policy to that user. Now, with the dial plan, again, that determines what numbers they can dial and what happens to those numbers when they dial them. If the number dialed matches the dial plan and it gets normalized, then the voice routing policy that's assigned to the user kicks in. Now, in the Teams world, there really isn't much happening with this voice routing policy. It's not like all the different settings that were available in a voice policy with Skype for Business. The voice routing policy simply determines which PSTN usages are we going to iterate through in our attempts to route this call. You can see on the US side that we've got a US domestic voice routing policy and a US international voice routing policy. So the voice routing policy might really be just serving to make sure that we are controlling what types of calls users can make as well. You'll notice we also have national, international, etc., different examples on the other side. Now, based on the PSTN usages, we have a couple examples there that are named very similar to the voice routing policy. The PSTN usages, like with Skype for Business, they're just the glue between a policy, a voice routing policy, and a voice route. And many people have also, ever since Skype and Link, people get confused about, well, why that middleman there? The reason for that middle piece, the PSTN usage, is that if you just have one PSTN usage, then it's really just kind of a pass-through component that doesn't do much. If you have multiple PSTN usages, this is where you can really get clever with prioritizing which route a call is going to go through. It's going to try the PSTN usages in order based on the way that they're attached to the voice routing policy. We'll see what this looks like in a minute in the next example. And then finally, the voice route. So a PSTN usage can be connected to one or more voice routes, and the voice route will be something that identifies a gateway and also has a translation pattern associated with it. So we might say, okay, this voice route is going to the Texas, the Texas SBC, but the Texas domestic voice route is only going to allow you to match patterns that are domestic numbers. If an international number is tried over that voice route, it'll fail because it only accepts the domestic pattern. So that's kind of why you have multiple routes to the same SBC, so that you can control the types of dialing that are going to one or the other. Here are those examples. Let's start on the right. This is a very basic example, and I'm just using the US ones here. We've got our voice routing policy for domestic. So these are users that are only allowed to call domestically. We don't let these users call internationally, so we assign them the US domestic voice routing policy. That voice routing policy has a PSTN usage called US domestic. And that's the only PSTN usage it's got. So it's, again, just kind of a middle piece. That PSTN usage is associated with two different voice routes, which have their own gateways. You have the New York domestic voice route or the Texas domestic voice route. Obviously, there is an SBC in New York and an SBC in Texas. And I did not update my slide in this. Let me go back on that bottom right one there, bottom left one, to say Texas, but it should say Texas. First, because of the order, New York is our priority. We're going to send all calls we can through New York, and anything that we can't, we'll send through Texas. Then on the international side, we make this a little more complex. We've got the international voice routing policy, but there are two PSTN usages. So first, we're going to try the US domestic one. Now, if this person dialed an international number, it's going to try the US domestic route first, and it's going to go to that New York domestic voice route, and it's not going to match the domestic translation pattern, so it'll fail. Then it will try the Texas domestic voice route, and it won't match that domestic translation pattern, so it'll fail. Then it will go to the second PSTN usage, the international one. It'll try New York, and when it gets a matching international translation pattern, it will succeed, and the call will route to our New York gateway. Now, if that New York gateway is down, it will try the Texas one. It will also match, and then the call will go out Texas. So this is an example of how we can control which calls are allowed, as well as how we can implement failover. Best of both worlds. So you can route specific calls or dialed patterns, as we see here, through your direct routing. So maybe you have calls that you want to go the analog route or PBX coexistence scenarios. And then if your call patterns don't match those calls over direct routing, and you have calling plans assigned to that user, then they can be allowed to use the calling plan through Microsoft for all other calls. So it is possible to have a user be able to route calls either via out Microsoft or via direct routing. Again, this will require licensing with calling plans for a user to do that. Native Microsoft 365 phone system capabilities. I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit here because I feel like I'm getting close to the Q&A time. So let's jump into this quickly. PSTN calling and call control. What can we do within Microsoft 365? We can place and receive PSTN calls. We have dial tone, hooray. We also have Azure voicemail, giving us a pretty good and fairly full-featured voicemail experience. We can manage our voicemail and our greeting and all of that right from within the Teams client. You have all the normal call control pieces built right into the client as well. Your hold, transferring, consult transfer, all that good stuff. Call part capabilities, one of those enterprise voice-like capabilities that finally made its way into the platform a while ago. You get a call that comes in, say, please hold, I'll find someone for you. You park that call, and then you make an announcement or send an IM or whatever that there is a call waiting in the call park with this code number, and somebody else can pick up that call once they input the code. Finally, you can do things like call forwarding, simultaneous ring, busy on busy, all these typical end user call decisions that can be made. Some of the enterprise grade features that kind of came after the original deployment of what used to be Cloud PBX and is now Microsoft 365 phone system. We've got auto attendance, and we can even achieve various levels of menu options within our auto attendance by nesting auto attendance within each other. Call queues, formerly known as hunt groups and other locations. We have different types of call queues with different routing logic that can be implemented. The call queues can be called directly with their own phone number, or they can be nested within an auto attendant. There's a little bit of flexibility there. Dynamic E911 has finally made its way onto the scene, and for those organizations that have strict requirements around that. And then location-based routing, which was a big showstopper for organizations that had those governmental requirements that made location-based routing be a very necessary thing. And then delegates and shared line appearance. So the delegates, shared line appearance, you know, if you're not familiar with these, they're typically referred to as your boss admin scenarios, where you've got someone who manages, or a group of people that manages calls for an or a boss. These are all now in the Microsoft Teams environment. Gluing it all together with direct routing. So what is direct routing again? Direct routing at the simplest level is a logical TLS connection between the Microsoft Teams cloud environment, telephony environment, and your quote unquote on-prem session border controller. So we see in this image here, this is a very base example of what direct routing accomplishes. You've got Microsoft Teams up in the cloud, and your users have all their calling capabilities there. And some of them place their calls out there, and that's the end of that story for them. But this shows that where direct routing shines and what it does. It brings your on-prem environment, which is this big blue rectangle, and all of the devices that are in that environment that cannot connect to Teams, it brings them all into your internal calling solution through a session border controller that your direct routing connection is connected to. And then on top of that, if you need to have your dial tone come in through that session border controller as well, you can set up a SIP trunk or whatever other type of carrier connection you need to have coming in from the PSTN and your local carrier into that session border controller. Or maybe your PSTN is coming in through that PBX off to the right. Still, you get your dial tone routed through that PBX to the SBC and up to Teams. But this is the very, at its basis, the very definition of what direct routing is supposed to accomplish for you. It is bridging on-prem telephony capabilities with the Microsoft 365 phone system and Microsoft Teams client. As far as the vendors that are playing in this space, this list has actually grown quite a bit recently, and I'm a little bit ashamed to admit it, but there may have been 1 or 2 names on here that I didn't realize were here until I put this slide together. But you can see we've got Audio Codes, Ribbon, TE Systems, Oracle, Cisco, ThinkTel, Metaswitch. Probably the one that has made the biggest headlines recently. There have been a lot of Cisco-based customers that have been very interested in connecting their existing Cisco telephony environment with Microsoft and leveraging their existing Cisco cubes for doing such. And now that that was released into general availability most recently, that's kind of where some of the more recent buzz came from. But if you go to this link at the bottom, you can take a look at all those border controllers that are there for each vendor and what the different requirements are, supported software levels, all that jazz. Direct routing deployment options. So on a physical device, you're going to want to have a physical device if you have to have analog or non-SIP carrier connections from other that are coming into the SBC itself. If you can have those connections come into some other device that then connects to your SBC via IP or SIP-based connection, then you can keep the SBC virtual. But if not, if those physical connections have to connect directly to the SBC, then you're going to want to put a physical device in there. And you may just end up wanting to do that because you have some specific requirements around that or high availability requirements, whatever the case is. There are definite needs for putting physical devices in your own data center or in a colo center, whatever the case is. That's certainly one option. Then we go to virtual, and there are many different platforms that you can deploy virtual in. You can deploy within Azure, VMware, Hyper-V, AWS as well. Some of them even have streamlined the ability to deploy in Azure with things like having an Azure Marketplace option that makes it more templated to deploy their virtual SBC. Others have templates that make it easy to just deploy in your own data center. So lots of options there. And taking virtual to the next step, a type of virtual, if you will, is the hosted model. There are lots of vendors out there that have made this possible, that are delivering direct routing capabilities to your organization, but they manage it all within their own environment so that you don't have to set it up, support it, input new routing rules, whatever the case may be. A few final additional considerations. Remember to think about your common area phones. These are phones that will sign into Microsoft Teams on a lesser license level, and usually they have to be physical phones that are deployed in your most commonly accessed areas in a company. Definitely something to bake into this overall strategy. Hardware and handset requirements. We talked a bit about hardware and handsets already. Make sure that when you're acquiring new hardware that you need, that you look at the certified solutions when you're purchasing your handsets and your headsets, as well as third-party add-ons. There's lots of stuff that's coming out on a third-party level that Microsoft certification is being developed for. Having a certified solution brings numerous benefits and will decrease your headache in the long run. So please, as you build out these complex call flow scenarios, make sure you're baking in certified wherever you can. And then finally, make sure you understand, and not just you, but everybody involved in the project, what integration actually means. And I've had a lot of customers, especially around this Cisco conversation that I mentioned recently, where this has been a sticking point. A lot of people have thought, great, we can now integrate with Cisco. And instead of thinking, cool, we can connect to Cisco through that cube router and direct routing, they kind of get an idea in their head that they can integrate presence and chat capabilities and all these other things with direct routing at the center of it all. And so really making sure we understand what integration means for different scenarios can be a really good sticking point to make sure that all stakeholders have a good handle on. And that is it for the technical portion of this. I didn't leave a lot of time for Q&A here. I want to make sure that we give a incredibly huge thank you and shout out to the many wonderful sponsors that partnered with Mark and team to make Commsverse a reality. Thank you to all of them for making this happen, for supporting us, supporting them in the middle of all this. And please, if you have time, visit these various vendors and sponsors in the virtual sponsor space. I'm drawing a huge lack of what that word is now. That's really embarrassing. In the alt space virtual reality center there, you can go and visit many of these people, talk to people in VR. It's really cool, and they've got a pretty cool booth space set up for all the ones that are there. Finally, Q&A. Even though we're right at about time, I put a couple links at the bottom. I would really love your feedback if you could. I know I was talking at 1,000,000 miles a minute trying to cram that all in, but if you can give us feedback, there is the survey link on top, and I'd really appreciate that. And then going beyond the feedback, we'll have a breakout session. We might want to take actually the Q&A over to the breakout session and kind of talk from there. But I want to thank you all very much for coming. Really appreciated having everyone on.
Thank you very much, Josh. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, so I shall just quickly run through those for you. And awesome. The first one is from Tim, and he's asking, in that setup, would the calls use the SBC in round robin or a serial manner?
Okay, I'm assuming that we are talking about where we have multiple SBCs for a single location. And if there's more clarity you want to add to that, please join me in the breakout afterwards, because I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding the nature of the question. But that's kind of where where all those PSTN usages and voice routes come into play. You want to make sure that you're understanding which SBC you're going to hit first and prioritizing them where you can. Inbound calls, that's something that's going to be decided, beyond the SBC and beyond the team solution. So you'd have to work out from the carrier side how calls are coming in that way.
Okay, awesome. And the next question is, it's an anonymous question, and it is, what is the topology when hosting an audio codes mediant SBC/Azure and SIP trunk?
And SIP trunk. Okay. Yeah. So in that case, your connection to the SBC from Microsoft Teams, even if it's not in Azure, is a logical connection, right? You're pointing to a public IP address from Microsoft's environment, and you're securing it with TLS. So you're doing the same thing here. You're pointing to the public IP address that you've gotten through Azure, securing that connection with TLS, and then from the SBC that's in Azure, you have another SIP trunk that's set up on it that goes to your carrier. So really, it's not much different than if you had a virtual machine in your own data center. They're two logical connections, one SIP-based, the other a TLS connection, and they are operating the same way. It's just that the virtual machine lives in a different physical location than if it were virtualized in your own data center.
Amazing, thank you. That's all the Q&A here. And that's all the time we have for the session. So if you'd like to talk some more with Josh following the session, you can find him in the session breakout area. Please check the Q&A for the link to that to join that meeting. And thank you all so much for watching.
Thank you all. Awesome.